Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast.
The podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
And now, your host, Dustin Jones.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. And this week's short comes from Meggen Lowry. She is a physio from Down Under in Australia. She has been an amazing asset to the Senior Rehab Project community. She has been an awesome member in the Facebook group. Any of you all in that Facebook group, I guarantee you have interacted with her in some way, shape, or form, whether you've read her posts or the articles she shares, or has probably answered one of your questions. I just really appreciate her perspective and her heart for older people. But also, she's a very innovative thinker and brings some cool technology and also different thoughts to the world of caring for older adults, specifically those with dementia. She is actually one of two people behind Clock Yourself, which is an app that you can get in the iTunes store, also as Google Play. But she actually read a post that she wrote that she wanted to share with you all, the Senior Rehab Project crew. This post is titled, "The Things You Find Scribbled in the Margins," and this is read by Meggen Lowry.
I had a bad day yesterday. It was one of those days when everything took 3 times longer to do, and even the simple things were just so much harder than they should have been. But there was a silver lining that gave me new perspective on frustration and on dementia and on the curious behavior that frustration can elicit. So I'm going to share that with you now. It really came from me stumbling on a note that I'd made to myself years ago, scribbled in the margin of some reading material. It was a quote from a client, and I read it at the end of a really frustrating day. Now, I'm aware that my voice is pretty high-pitched, so you're just going to have to work with me and imagine an older woman's voice, and I will emphasize the words that I had written down in capital letters and underlined. Quote, "I don't read a lot of books because when I read every word, and by the time you read every word and you go back to each one, it takes a lot of time." Unquote. And then I'd written ACAT client, brackets, woman with dementia, close brackets. So ACAT was referring to the Metro South Aged Care Assessment Team. It was a great organisation that I worked for about 5 years ago. It was less of a physiotherapy role and more of a case management role. Sometimes I felt more like an OT. I worked with OTs and geriatricians, and it was really about visiting older people in their homes or their aged care facilities or their hospitals and performing like a conversational style structured assessment to identify what things they like to do and then what things they needed help with. And then I'd organize services and put in place backup plans and sort of government financial approvals for things that they might need down the track to ensure that they were supported. Now, I can't even remember the client whose words I had scribbled down in the margins of that paper, but I'm almost sure that I didn't really understand her as well as I thought I did. Now, I hope this story about my light bulb moment at the end of a very frustrating, bad day illuminates something more for you too. The day started out all right. I wasn't stressed in the morning. My keys weren't lost. I knew that they were in the glove box of my partner's car and that I was just going to get them later on that evening. So I just took my spare car key and I left my apartment door secretly unlocked. But then I realized when I got to my car that the battery in the spare key was flat. So without a central locking mechanism, I'd have to manually unlock and lock the car doors that day. And, that was a first world problem. I smirked and got on with it. When I arrived at my first client's home early in the morning, I locked my car door and then I walked around to the boot to retrieve the basket of equipment that I take out for every appointment. There was no way to manually unlock the boot. Damn it. And then, to make it even trickier, I discovered that the only keyhole on the whole bloody Subaru station wagon was on the driver's side door. So my car suddenly became a 3D puzzle and I was pushed for time to solve it. Here's what I did. I opened the driver's side door, then I reached around to unlock a rear passenger door. I climbed through that rear passenger door, and then I rearranged things in my boot so that I could reach the inside latch on the boot to open it. But there was no inside latch. Thanks very much, Subaru. Great design. So I tugged on this basket of equipment and I dragged it forwards to the back seat. And of course, I lost bits and pieces along the way. And then I managed to get that basket out of the car. Mission accomplished. I proceeded to the client's house looking a little bit disheveled. I apologized for my tardiness and, I just blamed the traffic because it was just a much easier excuse than relaying the comedy of errors that led me to, navigate an obstacle course on my hands and knees in my parked vehicle. So after that appointment, when I returned to my car, I walked around to put that basket on the front passenger seat instead of the boot. Silly me, I'd forgotten that I couldn't unlock that door from the outside. How could I have forgotten something that I just figured out an hour ago? I giggled at my absent-mindedness and I went back around to the driver's side door and I unlocked it, and then I reached through to the passenger door to unlock it from the inside. Then I got out, I walked around the car, put the basket on the passenger seat and drove off. Now, if listening to this is frustrating for you, that's kind of the point, so please persevere with me. 30 seconds later, I'd only gotten around the corner when the continuous beep, beep, beeping started. I checked the petrol gauge, the temperature, the handbrake, everything seemed in order, so I just put up with it. And after driving 10 minutes trying to hear the GPS audio instructions over this incessant beeping, I realized that a seatbelt light was on. The car had detected the weight of the basket on the passenger seat and thought that it was an unrestrained passenger, so I pulled over, put the seatbelt around the basket, drove off again. Problem solved. When I arrived at the next client's home, the big basket was in the way of the interior passenger door, and I had locked that door when I put the basket in. I don't know why I had locked that door, but I had just done it. So I tried to carry the basket out with me through the driver's side door to save time, but it was a really awkward sized basket and it got stuck on the steering wheel, activating the horn. I'm not kidding. It took me 15 seconds to dislodge it. That toot lasted for 15 painful seconds in the morning. It was a terrible first impression of a new client. So this was initial assessment. My new client, he just greeted me at the door, very grumpy old man, really unhappy that I was late, and of course that I'd just woken up half his neighborhood with my car horn. So I offered a brief explanation which sounded unsatisfactory even to me, but by that point I was just really highly strung and I didn't want to dwell on the source of my frustration. Besides, the conversation, it just would have been a waste of time for both of us. I mean, I just did my best to patch up the rapport and I completed his initial assessment, but I was acutely aware that he thought I was a silly young girl and he probably wouldn't get me back. So I gave up on carrying the basket after that, and I just carried items in my hands that I thought I would probably need for each person's home visit. But because my hands were so full when opening doors, I dropped things on the floor, and then, there'd be times when I'd have to run out to my car to get extra things from the basket. These were just minor mistakes, but one after another, it made me feel incompetent. And of course, I had to skip lunch to make up for lost time. And then, look, I'll save you the rest of it because I had 7 more patients that day. But by the time I got back to my unit complex, I was absolutely spent. And I still had to wait in my car until some other tenant pulled into the driveway because that tenant would have keys to enter the foyer and I didn't have any. So to pass the time, I reached for a folder of reading material from my boot. And there it was. In the margins of one of those readings I'd filed in the folder years earlier, that quote, I'm going to read it again. Quote, I don't read a lot of books because when I do, I read every word. And by the time you read every word, you go back to each one and it takes a lot of time. Unquote. ACAT client, woman with dementia. I pondered the quote in my car. I thought, it reflected a woman who lacked insight into her dementia and was trying to make sense of her situation. I thought she was trying to justify or make an excuse for no longer reading books. And, that must have struck a chord with me 5 years ago, so I'd written it down. And then a car pulled into my apartment complex. So I just dashed out of my car and I followed the woman to the door of the lobby. Now, she noticed me initially rushing on foot, and then I slowed right down and hung back behind her while she unlocked the door. I was standing a little too close for comfort so that I could catch that heavy door before it shut. Now, I know she noticed my unusual behavior. I noticed her noticing it. I could have just explained myself and she'd have laughed and we would have exchanged pleasantries. But, I just didn't have the energy. I felt foolish and frazzled, and I didn't want to introduce myself to a neighbour in that frame of mind. I just wanted to go upstairs and eat some food and forget about my day. And as I walked past her in the stairwell, I realised something. I realised that my frustration had elicited some curious behaviour in me, just like it often does with people who have dementia. Instead of words on a page that take a lot of time for someone to make sense of, the source of my frustration was a station wagon full of equipment with only one of its 5 doors functioning properly. By the time I unlocked every door and I went back and reached through another door and relocked each and every one of them again, it took me a lot of time. The whole ordeal felt just way too complicated to put into words. And now that I've done it, I regret it because I'm boring you. But, that's probably because that frustration that I experienced just sounds too trivial to share with anyone, with my clients or with the lady at the door at the apartment complex who was wondering why I was behaving so strangely. But I'm not insightless. I wasn't insightless about my problem. I understood my problem very well, better than anyone else could. They hadn't been inside my car. They didn't know the dimensions of the basket. They hadn't tried different strategies to retrieve that basket every which way, so they wouldn't understand why it was so much of a problem for me. Maybe that woman whose words I had written down in the margins of that paper, that woman who I'd forgotten now, maybe she didn't lack insight at all. Maybe those words were profound for a different reason. Maybe she understood her dementia and her cognitive limitations better than anyone else could. I'll read a part of that quote again. By the time you read every word and you go back to each one, it takes a lot of time. How frustrating is that? Maybe she'd chosen those words to help me gain insight into her situation. And so I wonder how different things would be in light of my own behavior and my own frustration that day. I wonder how different things would be if instead of a malfunctioning key, there was a cruel underlying disease process disrupting the circuitry in my brain that meant I had to battle with that arduous process every single time I drove to a home visit. How would I cope with that day in and day out? How much frustration can I take before I would give up driving or before I would give up my work? I wonder if I'd be the type of older person to cover it up and hope that people didn't notice, or if I'd be willing to actually sit down and explain my problems with the best words I could find to an aged care assessor who is a third of my age, and if I'd be willing to ask her for help.
Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you should hop on over to seniorrehabproject.com to find more helpful content. You can also find out how you can join the team and be a part of the private Facebook group, the monthly mastermind meetup, and have a say in the content and direction of this podcast. Once again, that's seniorrehabproject.com. I appreciate you, and I'll talk with you soon. But in the meantime, do not forget to stay funky.